Okay, so this is a video to walk through the update from the prior reserve protocol plan to the updated plan. Um, so I'll start by talking a little bit about the vision. The vision remains exactly the same, but just to refresh anyone who isn't particularly familiar with it. So what we're driving towards here is creating a single state-independent asset-backed world reserve currency. Um, will we be able to do that? Will reserve actually become the world reserve currency? We don't know, of course, but that is the vision. That is the thing that we are ultimately driving towards creating. And so this is meant to be stable in global average purchasing power from month to month, like in the short term. And much like the US dollar or the euro is today. And it's also meant to be stable in global average purchasing power from century to century. And that's something that is not true about something like the US dollar, for instance. So basically we're aiming for short-term stability and long-term stability. And even when major nations decline, the idea is that the main currency would not. So if you had this state-independent currency that didn't depend on any particular nation to maintain its stability and effectiveness, then even if a major nation that backed a popular currency were to go into decline, then this currency would continue to chug along in much the same way, continue to be useful in much the same way. That is the vision. And so if we achieve this, we would have a kind of politically neutral form of money, something that's not controlled by any one nation. And people like to talk about this with Bitcoin, and that I think that is one thing that's very cool about Bitcoin. But the idea is to have something that functions as money in terms of having that stability, both short-term and long-term, while also achieving that political neutrality. So I want to talk about two major assumptions that we are making when we design this protocol, because it's really important that these things be true for this protocol to make sense. We believe they're true, but they are important assumptions to call out and to be aware of. So one is that we're assuming that basically like once crypto really gets going and lots of things really get tokenized, then at all times on into the future, there will be some basket of assets that exists, even tokenized assets that exist on chain, that in aggregate have short-term stable value. So that short-term stable value that we're talking about just from like month to month is meant to be maintained by some particular basket at all times. And then number two, how do we get to that long-term stability? We're not necessarily assuming that you would be able to just pick a basket that would stay stable for an entire century. Instead, what we're assuming is that through some form of decentralized governance, the protocol can evolve that basket over the course of time in order to achieve that long-term stable value. And so, that's a complicated governance challenge, and it's certainly not proven that that's possible through the kinds of decentralized governance that are available on chain, but we are starting with the assumption that that is possible and working to build something that works in that way. So the first thing I want to describe here in terms of how the protocol works, I want to start by doing an overview of how the prior protocol worked. So basically, we have a smart contract. For some reason, I always think that this is what a smart contract should look like. It's like a page with the corner cut off. Maybe it's like a Battlestar Galactica thing. Anyway, and this smart contract is kind of representing all the smart contracts of the protocol. Just imagine it's one smart contract. It's actually probably like 10 or something, 15. But and now we have some reserve stablecoins out in circulation. So the purple in these diagrams will be stablecoins. And these stablecoins are backed by collateral assets that are held by the smart contract. And so let's say that there's a few different kinds of collateral assets. Let's say there's some of these green coins. Let's say that there's some yellow coins that are worth a little bit less. We're using size to indicate approximate value in the market. And let's say there's some brown coins that are worth about the same as the green coins. Alright, so we can see visually that, this size is about the same as this size, indicating, the equivalence in value between these coins backing the reserve stablecoins. So, in the prior protocol and in the new protocol, this part is pretty similar. The stablecoin is redeemable for the underlying collateral tokens, and that's what gives it its value. So if you redeem one of these stablecoins, you get the appropriate share of the basket of the collateral assets. Okay, and so where does RSR come into this? So let's look at what happens now if one of these collateral tokens defaults, meaning the peg breaks for some reason, like the underlying collateral turns out to not be there, if it's like a dollar stablecoin, or if it's a more complicated token, maybe there's a smart contract bug and it loses its value because of that or something, right? There's different things that could cause pegged tokens to lose their value. So let's say that happens, and let's say that these green coins now lose a bunch of their value, and they're worth, let's just say that they're worth like almost nothing. So now, obviously, we can see the problem. We have this area of backing that's supposed to be made up by these green coins, but they've defaulted and they're not worth as much. So in the prior protocol, so now we have, there's RSR tokens are out there floating around. People have them and they're doing whatever with them. So I'll draw RSR tokens in black. I guess let's make them small. And there's just a bunch out here. There we go. There's our RSR supply out there in the world. Okay, so what does the protocol do? Like, what does the prior version of the protocol do? Well, the prior version of the protocol, it doesn't have any RSR in its control in this smart contract. And so what it does is it actually mints new RSR to make up for this additional value that's been lost. So it'll actually create new RSR tokens from nothing until it has enough to basically make up for this difference. A little messy. And then it will take all of these tokens. So let's say now that the protocol wants to rebalance, and let's say we want more of these brown coins. We've decided, okay, the green coin defaulted. The safest thing now is to hold an additional share of these brown coins in the basket. So the protocol is going to be looking for someone. It's going to be looking for someone who has these brown coins out in the market. So let's say that there's someone over here holding these brown coins that the protocol wants to trade for. So now the protocol will trade what's left of the value of these green coins and all of this newly minted RSR. And in exchange, it will get these brown coins from this person out in the market. And now you can see we have the equivalence again, and the reserve stable coins are backed. So that's basically how the prior protocol would work. So now these green coins, they're just off whatever they're held by, whoever the protocol ended up trading with on DEXs or however that would work. But now these new RSR tokens are part of the RSR supply. So now the RSR supply has gone up as a result of this. And so that's kind of, that's the way that the RSR token holders would provide the backstop in the prior version of the reserve protocol, is simply that more RSR tokens could be minted, and so the RSR supply could be increased. But so it's also the case that the RSR supply was able to be decreased. through arbitrage, through the arbitrage process. And well, how does that work? So first off, there's the notion that the protocol can generate revenue, right? So basically, the protocol in our prior design was able to generate revenue and capture that revenue in RSV stablecoins. Okay, and there's different potential sources of revenue that the protocol can take advantage of that we've mentioned in the past. So there's transaction fees, there's basically issuer fees, like the issuers of these stablecoins could pay to have a portion of the basket, and there's also the appreciation of these collateral assets themselves, and that could, and that there's sort of a variation on that, which could come from the protocol itself lending these out in order to generate a yield, similar to how Compound or several other DeFi protocols work. So I'm going to skip over that in detail for now. Maybe we'll touch on that in a minute. But for now, let's just say, okay, the protocol has generated some revenue. So we have these RSV stablecoins, these reserve stablecoins in the revenue pool, also held by this smart contract. What happens? So in this situation, and let's actually just, to make this example a little more clear, I'm going to go ahead and just say it's generated a lot of revenue by this point. So it's generated a huge amount of revenue relative to the circulating supply and relative to the asset backing. And so then the RSR holders are able to purchase those RSV tokens during periods where the supply needs to expand, right? So let's say that we're in a situation where the price of the reserve token is above what it should be given the value of the collateral assets. In that situation, this is where this revenue would get unlocked. Get unlocked through the RSR holders purchasing it in the course of arbitrage. What does that mean? So that basically means that these tokens would be purchased by RSR holders. And so, we need like an equivalent amount of RSR. Let's say it's about like that for those tokens. And so that RSR, those RSR holders in particular, those specific ones that were holding that RSR, would have come to the protocol and made that purchase and said, okay, you can have these RSR, and in exchange, I'll get these RSV tokens. And so now that adds to the number of RSV tokens in circulation. Looks like I didn't draw those quite to scale. And now that the protocol has sold off those RSV tokens and has these RSR tokens, it doesn't have anything to do with them, so it just burns them. Okay, so now we can see that the RSR supply would have gone down from that. So basically, the RSR supply, it was flexible. It could go up in the case of a default where more RSR needed to be minted, and it could go down in the case that revenue was generated and was purchased by RSR holders through the arbitrage process. And so one thing to note about the way that the prior protocol was designed is that these reserve stablecoins that could be generated as revenue, they would never be distributed directly to RSR holders. It's not the case that these coins would be given to RSR holders who get to keep holding their RSR and also get any amount of that income. Instead, it was only the case that these coins could be purchased, where someone would have to come and spend their RSR tokens in order to purchase these revenue assets, and that's what would cause the burning of RSR. Okay, so now let's look at how the new protocol differs. There's a couple of key ways that happens. So some things are the same. So let's sort of get to our initial setup here. Got some green coins again. And oops. There's our RSR supply. So some things that are same, it's still the same that the reserve stablecoins are backed by a basket of assets in much the same way. Issuability and redeemability is the same. And we still have RSR tokens, but the way that the RSR token is used is a little bit different. Now, it's important to note that the fundamental economics of the situation are actually quite similar. Like, we really aren't changing the economics of the protocol in a macro way. What we're doing is actually sort of focusing those same economics, the same principles, and the same sort of potential for profit and the same potential for loss, but we're actually giving RSR holders more individual choice, and I'll explain that. I'll try to explain that now. So one different thing in the new protocol is that RSR holders can actually choose to stake their RSR on a reserve token. So I'll draw that like this. Let's say that this much RSR gets staked on this reserve token. Well, what does it mean to stake? So let's look at two scenarios. We'll look at what happens if the reserve token, if some of the collateral depreciates or defaults, rather, and then we'll also look at what happens when the reserve token generates revenue. Both of those, again, it's fundamentally a very similar outcome, but it's a little bit different because RSR holders have more individual choice about what to be exposed to. So let's say that, again, the green coins become worth a whole lot less, right? So now we have our green coins worth almost nothing, and we have, again, this collateral deficit that we need to make up for. Well, the difference is in this scenario, rather than minting new RSR and increasing the RSR supply, the way that the protocol works is it actually takes RSR that's staked on that reserve token, and it uses that instead. Okay, so let's say that this is about enough. We'll just say that that fits in. And so now it's gotten the RSR that it needed, and instead of having to mint it, it just seized it from the RSR that was staked. And so that does mean that the people who had come and staked RSR have now lost some of their RSR. Their amount of RSR per person has gone down. And that affects everyone equally who has chosen to stake on that particular reserve stablecoin. But these people out here who just had their RSR elsewhere, they're totally unaffected, okay? Because in the other scenario, the supply would have been increased overall, but in this scenario, the total supply stays exactly the same because the smart contract is just taking the RSR that is already staked. So the supply is fixed. But then the smart contract does, a similar thing. So let's say again that we wanted to purchase, some of these sort of brown coins in order to make up for the deficit. And so the protocol is going to say, okay, I'll trade you these green coins and all this RSR for those brown coins. Here we go. We've made up for the deficit. So we've ended up in the same situation. And similarly, now these green coins go out to whomever, and these RSR coins are now part of the supply that's not staked, that's out in the world floating around. But notice that the total RSR supply, again, has stayed the same. It hasn't gone up. So that's the significant difference in that direction is that the RSR supply doesn't go up, and instead, the people who've chosen to stake individually end up losing out. And again, the people who hold this RSR out here who hadn't chosen to stake on that reserve token are unaffected. And so we're starting to hopefully see what I mean by giving more individual choice. You can choose, okay, I want to go participate in this particular stablecoin. I want the benefits of that, which I'll go over in a second, and I'm willing to take the risks given my understanding of that particular stablecoin. Whereas other people could choose, I don't really want to participate in that reserve stablecoin. Maybe I'll wait it out, or maybe I'll go participate in a different reserve stablecoin. And so they don't have to be exposed to the risk of this particular basket of assets if they choose not to. Okay, now let's look at what happens when the reserve stablecoin generates revenue. And again, I'm going to gloss over the mechanisms for revenue because those aren't changing really at all. We're just looking at a different distribution, what happens once it occurs. So let's say that the smart contract has captured some revenue. I guess I'll try try to make it a similar amount as what we saw last time. And okay, so what happens, right? So in the old case, what would happen is, you know, these RSR holders could purchase these tokens through the course of arbitrage, and that would reduce the RSR supply. But then only the RSR holders who came and purchased those tokens would be the recipients of the revenue, and they would have to spend their RSR to get the revenue. So they'd just be making a trade of RSR for revenue. In this case, what happens is that these tokens are actually just distributed directly to like the holders of this RSR. So whoever it is that staked this RSR, they directly receive these revenue tokens. So basically, if you stake, you're the direct recipient of revenue that's generated by that particular reserve stablecoin. And so notably, that means that the RSR supply again was unaffected. So in this case, the RSR supply is essentially fixed. It's just staying at the same supply, regardless of whether revenue is being generated and regardless of whether there's like a black swan event where one of the collateral assets defaults. And so, but then the difference is that you can be an RSR holder and you can stake your RSR, and if there isn't a default, then without any loss, you're just receiving revenue. You're receiving income for the work that you're doing in the system of basically offering up your token as a backstop. And you have to choose which reserve tokens you want to stake that RSR on. You could look at, let's say 2 different reserve tokens, one that's a little bit riskier but has a higher yield, one that's a little bit lower risk but has a lower yield, and you could choose which one, or you could stake across both of them and split your RSR if you choose to, in order to choose, well, where do you want to go to earn some revenue. So then one natural question is like, well, how much revenue would you actually get? And that you can sort of see here that that's dependent on a number of different factors. So one is just, well, how many reserve stablecoins are in circulation? How much collateral is there? That's going to determine the absolute amount of revenue that's generated. And then there's also the question of, well, how many RSR stakers is that revenue being split across, right? So if we're in a scenario where, where like very little RSR is staked, let's say we're in this scenario, let's say this much revenue has been generated, well, then you can see, if we're treating this as, where area represents the amount of value, then, this is visually showing us like, okay, that's like a really huge return for this much RSR. Okay, but you can imagine, well, what if a whole lot more RSR is staked, right? So let's kind of go like this. Let's say, this much is staked. Well, then you can see that these revenue coins are going to get divided up amongst a much larger number of holders. So the rate of return will be lower. And so I expect that the amount of RSR that's staked on any particular reserve stablecoin will reach some sort of equilibrium, right? Because if you're in that scenario, let's say you're in the scenario, let's see if we can just go back. Let's say you're in that scenario where there's only a tiny bit of RSR and there's like a lot of revenue coming out of the reserve stablecoin. Well, then there's a strong incentive for the next batch of RSR holders to go jump in and be like, hey, I want to be a part of that. And let's say that that's still a really good ratio where it's like, that's still a lot of revenue. It's like, okay, well, there's still an incentive for more people to come and stake and be like, I want to be a part of that too. But every time that more people come and stake, now that revenue is being divided up amongst more people, right? And so it's like, okay, well, that's pretty interesting, but it's not that exciting. It's not as exciting as it was when there was only a few. And so maybe, maybe a few more RSR holders say, yeah, I want to be a part of that too. But then maybe you reach the point where it's like, okay, that's like a satisfactory expected return. And these RSR holders are like, okay, there's something else I want to do with my capital. I want to go stake on some other reserve stablecoin, or some of these might just be held by people who are speculating but not staking. And so then, it may or may not be that other people come and buy these in order to stake. And so that's an important note as well. It's like, let's say that we're in this scenario, right, where these RSR tokens are out here circulating, not staked, and these ones are staked, and so there's a really significant revenue opportunity. Well, if the existing RSR holders aren't coming in and staking for some reason, then there's a strong financial incentive for someone to come and buy up some RSR tokens off the circulating supply and take them in and stake them in order to take advantage of that revenue opportunity. So that's again another force that you would expect to bring this to equilibrium. And again, if you had too many RSR staked and the revenue ended up being uninteresting, you'd expect some people to unstake and sort of get back and closer to that equilibrium state. So to go over some key differences one more time just to make sure they're clear. So in the prior version we talked about how it's not the case that this revenue is ever directed at is sort of ever distributed directly to RSR token holders. It was only the case that you had to trade in your RSR tokens to get that revenue. Whereas in this case, the revenue is directed just directly to the token holders who chose to stake their RSR on that particular reserve stablecoin. And then another key difference is that because there's no minting and burning of RSR in this design, the supply of RSR stays fixed forever. And so, so the difference there is rather than economic incentives being sort of designed to affect RSR holders collectively as an overall mass of token holders through changes in circulating supply, which could be indirect, and it's somewhat unpredictable what the economic impacts could be. People would always ask me, well, if the supply goes down, will the price go up? It's like, well, maybe. If the supply goes up, will the price go down? Maybe, probably. It's different if the revenue tokens that are generated actually get distributed directly to RSR holders, where again, they'd be distributed to the RSR holders that choose to stake on that particular reserve stablecoin, and they're distributed because of the fact they're distributed to those stakers because of the fact that those stakers have been willing to stand up and say, I will put my particular capital at risk to back this particular reserve stablecoin, even though the other reserve rights tokens are not necessarily at risk. So again, it's giving reserve rights holders the ability to choose sort of which risk they want to take and the ability to choose which income streams they want to participate in. So you might wonder, does this mean that the role of RSR, is it changing in the protocol, or is the role staying the same? Well, the answer is fundamentally it's staying pretty much the same, because RSR has always had in the prior protocol design sort of one main job of stabilizing RSV, but it was intended to stabilize RSV in two ways. The primary way is the one that we've been displaying, where in the case of a collateral asset default, where these collateral assets need to be replaced, the protocol could mint and sell additional RSR, because with an exchange rate peg, the difficult thing is always making sure you have enough capital to back the peg. And then the RSR token also played a role in stability during the arbitrage process, but that role was less essential. If you think about it economically, the ability to recapitalize is really an essential thing that RSR is providing, that pool of value is providing, and the participation in arbitrage, that was the way that we designed the protocol, but we found a way essentially to make that a little bit more elegant. So basically, arbitrage can still happen. So the arbitrage process that would have occurred with, in the case that RSR holders were coming and purchasing these revenue stablecoins that the protocol had captured, well, the same thing can happen. So if these revenue stablecoins have instead been distributed, so they've been distributed to those RSR stakers, and let's say the price of the stablecoin is a little bit too high, well, someone can come and bring additional collateral tokens to the smart contract. So they show up and they're like, all right, here's the collateral basket. I'd like to mint some more reserve tokens, And this is just a normal form of arbitrage that has always been a part of the protocol, that exists even with RSV, the version that's on chain today. And in exchange for bringing those, the protocol allows them to mint more RSV tokens, or reserve stablecoins, and so then they can go sell those on the marketplace and bring the price down. And then the same thing can happen in reverse with redemption. And so in this new protocol, like we've gone over, RSR is still playing the fundamental role of providing that backstop in the case of a collateral token default, right? The case where, if these tokens become worth less, then some RSR can actually be seized from the stakers and used to purchase additional collateral to make up for that default. So why did we make this change? One reason is just that it makes the economics of the protocol a little bit more elegant. It makes it a little bit easier to understand what's going on. So with the prior version of the protocol, as we saw when I went over that, it sort of is the case that it's hard to tell exactly what the economic impact is when more RSR tokens are being minted and sold into the market and diluting everybody collectively. And similarly, if RSR tokens are being bought off the market and burned, maybe that has an economic impact on other RSR holders, maybe it doesn't. In this updated version, you can see the economics very clearly, because you can see, okay, this is the exact amount of revenue that I would get as a staker, and you can see very clearly the risk that you're taking on, because those particular RSR tokens could be seized. If everybody staked their RSR tokens all together in the same place, then the net effect of that would be pretty similar. That would mean that if some of these RSR tokens had to be taken in order to be spent, well, that in expectation economically would be pretty similar to more RSR tokens having been minted, because they're taken from every single person pro rata. So if everybody chooses to stake, then the economics are similar. But maybe some people will choose not to stake on some reserve stablecoins or at all. And so again, it's giving people more individual choice. And there's a reason why we're excited about giving people that additional individual choice, which is that it enables something pretty cool that wasn't quite a part of the prior version of the protocol. So one thing that it enables is there to be multiple reserve stablecoins. And it actually enables the creation, it makes it so that the protocol can allow anyone to come and create a reserve stablecoin. And now I just want to say, because I think that there's a possible misconception here, the point is not to have zillions and zillions of stablecoins that all are in use and all are mass adopted in a fragmented way. If we thought that that would be the result of opening up the protocol to create more stablecoins, we probably wouldn't do it, because again, going back to the vision that I referred to at the beginning of this video, the idea is to ultimately have one world reserve currency that's asset backed, that's independent of of any particular nation state. I think that it's really powerful to have a single currency that a lot of people are using that has really intense network effects. I just think that that is, that actually provides a lot of utility. But the goal is to create an ecosystem that will end up producing that sort of all-star currency. And so we actually think that it's healthy to have a system where multiple can be created and can compete. And in part, that's because we believe that we'll end up seeing like a power law distribution. Like a power law, for anyone who doesn't know, is when you have a situation where it's like the first of something is like really big or like really popular, and then the next one, is like kind of big, but like not like the first one, and then the next one is actually like much smaller, and then you have, sort of like very small, sort of long tail, right? And so this is what we believe is going to happen, and we believe through a system of open competition, you can end up getting a better result for the currency that ends up being the most popular, and and it actually puts pressure on that most popular currency to perform well, because there is, another one, maybe in number 2, that could potentially overtake it theoretically, if the one that's most popular is not doing a very good job. And so you could potentially have a sort of a flippening of sorts, and that competitive pressure we think will cause whichever one wins out to actually be better. It's kind of like competition in capitalism, generally speaking. So let's look at what does this mean to have multiple. So our intention at the beginning is to have 2 that we will release, and also to basically design our contracts so that it's easy for others to deploy further stablecoins. So let me just illustrate this for a minute by just saying that we have different kinds of collateral tokens. So let's say we still have the green ones, and then we have in this other one, let's see, we have some blue ones, and don't actually have that many colors to choose from. Alright, well, we can have some red ones. Red sort of seems bad, so I guess if we have any default in the next example, they can be the red ones. Okay, and so let's say that this one is generating revenue at like a pretty fast pace, right? So we have like a bunch of revenue accruing here, so maybe then actually, maybe then all of these RSR holders come and stake over here. And let's say that this one is only generating, a little bit of revenue. This would be like sort of like half of a coin. And so, yeah, maybe like a few people decide that they want to come stake because, well, if there's nobody staked, then that revenue is worth something. But so you can see that, like, depending on how much revenue is being offered by these 2 different stablecoins, there'd be, a lot more demand to stake here than to stake here. Now, it also does matter what the risk is, right? So if this stablecoin had collateral tokens that were highly risky, well, then, so let's say that they, make a governance change and they add, a collateral asset that's, highly risky. Actually, no, let's say that this red one is highly risky. That's a perfect example. So maybe these people are really happy to stake, but then this red collateral token has been added, and they're like, screw that. We're going to go over here. We don't like that risk. Or if they wanted to, they could unstake entirely. Maybe they weren't interested in this other one for some reason. So they're like, no, we're just going to go back and chill and wait for now. So that's kind of what I mean about the RSR holders having choice. They can choose, where they want to stake. They can choose which revenue streams to participate in. Once you've staked in one of these on one of these stablecoins, there isn't anything further that you have to do, although you have to keep watching that stablecoin, monitoring the revenue, monitoring the risk, to decide whether or not you want to continue to stake. And actually, what I just said is like a little bit of a misstatement, because there are other features that that the protocol team is working on to include in staking, to basically optimize the staker experience. And so there could be further options for what you're going to do, but I'm going to ignore that for now because this is already kind of a lot of material, so I don't want to get into too much detail. All right, so I've been throwing around the term revenue a lot and kind of just pretending that, money just comes out of nowhere, but like, where does the revenue come from? So let's actually talk about that for a little bit. So there are basically 3 places, 3 sources of revenue that are available to reserve stablecoins. And I'm going to go over all 3 in enough detail, hopefully, to make sure that they make sense. And I'll talk a little bit about like which ones I think apply now, which ones I think will apply in the future, and which ones I'm like not sure if they'll ever apply. But it still makes sense to basically have them available as affordances. So the simplest form of revenue is basically transaction fees. So if these let's say that these reserve stablecoins are circulating and being spent. There could be some transaction fee that's taken out every time they circulate. It's pretty straightforward. So that's one possible source of revenue. Let's call that number one. The second possible source of revenue is a little bit less intuitive than a transaction fee. It's not something that we see that frequently, but it's something that we believe will exist in stablecoins like this at scale, potentially, which is basically issuer fees. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. So let's say that this stablecoin here is a type of coin. Let's say it's just a tokenized dollar, for instance. And so with a tokenized dollar, the issuer has dollars in a bank account, and you can redeem the coin for those dollars in the bank account. Except, maybe they have dollars in a bank account and they're getting some interest on that bank account, or maybe they're holding short-term treasuries and getting some yield on those treasuries, or maybe they're holding some other financial asset that's very similar to dollars, but they're earning money on that. That is their business model, right? They don't make money off of transaction fees of these tokens. They just make money off of the deposits and the capital that they have that's backing the tokens. So because of that, let's say that this reserve stablecoin has gotten really, really big. Let's say that there's like 100 billion or some huge amount of dollars worth of the stablecoin in circulation. Well, in that case, then this issuer that's issuing these coins is making a significant amount of money, and if they could get more of this basket, like if they could get twice as much of this basket, for instance, then they would actually make twice as much money, right? So like, what does that mean? It's like, all right, well, they would want, those collateral tokens to be replaced by more of these collateral tokens, because now they make more money. And so issuers at scale are likely to be willing to pay a fee to have a larger portion of this basket, or at least I believe that. We'll see what actually happens in practice. But you actually see something similar to this playing out already, right? Like if you deposit your USDC on Coinbase, you can earn some yield, right? That's basically an incentive that they're offering in order to cause more USDC to exist because there's a business model in the background that's making money. So basically, the issuer, I guess, sort of represent the issuer like a little bank or something. Apparently that's what a bank looks like. Might just pay, some fee. Let's say they pay it in that coin to the reserve stablecoin in exchange for having a larger share of the basket. So issuer fee is number 2. And number 3 is actually the one that is going to exist first, and it's a little bit more complicated. So number 3 is basically earning some sort of yield on the collateral assets that exist in the stablecoin. And there's 2 versions of this. So I'm going to go over one version first, and then another version second. And the second version is actually the one that's going to be included in this upcoming protocol release with one of the stablecoins that we're envisioning. So the first version is the protocol itself could be set up to lend out the collateral assets in an over-capitalized way, in an over-collateralized way, similar to what we see in DeFi. Common examples are Compound and Aave or Maker, all kind of work this way. So let's say somebody comes along and they would like to borrow some of these green stablecoins, and let's say that they have some wrapped bitcoins, okay? And they're like, okay, you can hold my wrapped bitcoins if I can borrow some stablecoins, and then I'll pay the stablecoins back in order to get my wrapped bitcoin. This is generally how this over-collateralized lending process works. So it's like, okay, the smart contract is like, okay, that's fine. If you give us enough wrapped Bitcoin, you can have this many stablecoins, and we'll have, I don't know, twice as many wrapped Bitcoin in order to make sure that we have enough money to cover our liabilities, and be able to cover this redemption. And so now, the ordinary thing that would happen if the loan is used and then returned is at some point the lender says, okay, all right, I'm done with the loan. Whatever I was doing with that, I'll take my Bitcoins back, and here's your green stablecoins back. Except because they were willing to pay an interest rate, it's like, and here's one more coin, right? And that's the interest, or maybe they even pay that in this case in the stablecoin, right? And so now we have some revenue that can be distributed to these RSR holders. But then there's also the question of what if they never come back and repay their loan, right? So what if we're still in this situation where they have the stablecoins, and we have this wrapped Bitcoin, and they're just like, all right, see ya. I'm going away. I'm done. So in this scenario, what the protocol can do is, let's say that this person's completely gone, and now there's actually another person who's come along who has some green stablecoins. The protocol can say, okay, we haven't gotten back the green stablecoins that we need, and also these Bitcoins are starting to be worth a little bit less. So we're starting to get a little bit nervous. Well, before they're not worth enough, the smart contract can say, okay, we're going to auction off these Bitcoins to make sure that we get enough green stablecoins, and actually even enough to make sure that we get the amount of revenue that we planned on getting. And so, this new participant who's come along has purchased this collateral in exchange for the tokens that the original borrower didn't pay back. And so, you're probably familiar with this. This is basically how all of the over-collateralized on-chain lending is working. This is how you can loan out capital completely anonymously in crypto. It's a pretty cool mechanism. And it's something that can be implemented directly in a reserve token. However, there's a different approach that gets you a similar result to direct loans being offered by the protocol. So let's say we had our earlier participant who was there. It's actually a slightly different participant. So let's say it's a new person. The little hat. You may recognize this character. So this person wants to mint more reserve stablecoins. Well, one thing we can do if we want to get the advantage of this on-chain lending without having to bake the lending functionality directly into the reserve protocol is to build on top of Aave and Compound and other DeFi protocols like that. And actually, they make it pretty easy to do that because those lending positions are tokenized. Okay, so follow me here. You'll see what I mean. This is pretty cool that this can work like this. So there's another smart contract out there that is some lending protocol. Okay, and so let's say that this person has some ordinary stablecoins, and they want to mint more reserve tokens. So they can come. So let's say that these reserve tokens don't exist yet. They can come to one of these other lending protocols and deposit these stablecoins in order to loan them out through, let's just say it's Compound, which is kind of the canonical example. And in exchange, this protocol creates some tokens that basically represent that person's balance and gives them those tokens and says, okay, you can come back and redeem these tokens anytime and you'll get the original tokens that you deposited to lend out. And if you've actually left them lent out for a while, then they will have generated some interest. And so you'll actually get back a little bit more than you started with. Okay? So then this person can come and deposit these tokens directly as collateral. right? So basically, the cool insight here is that a reserve stablecoin can hold these tokens, which indirectly represent the collateral tokens, in another lending protocol. And then these tokens, once they've been deposited into Compound, well, the same thing can happen with some further market participant. So let's say we have another person who doesn't have a hat, right? So our person has done that, and then they've gone off and they're doing their business. Someone else comes along and they're like, all right, I would be happy to borrow these green stablecoins, and I've got my wrapped Bitcoins. And so they do the same exact thing that we just talked about, but they're doing it now in Compound, right? So they deposit them, and they get these stable coins, and they go around and they do whatever it is that they're going to do with their stable coins, and then eventually they come back and pay them back, or Compound can, auction off their wrapped Bitcoins if it needs to, and they come and they pay them back, and of course they include, that's where the additional capital comes from, is that they have to pay some interest on that in order to get back their original collateral. And so now these tokens that were originally deposited, they now could be redeemed instead of by the guy with the hat. They could be redeemed by the reserve smart contract or by someone else who and I forgot to draw the fact that once those were deposited, we would have these additional reserve stablecoins that had gotten minted. So basically these tokens, originally they were worth 4 green coins, but now they're worth 5 green coins because of the fact that that interest accrued. And so if someone were to come and say, let's say someone came and redeemed this many of these reserve stablecoins, they're like, all right, I'm redeeming this many, give me the collateral tokens, because actually you would be issuing and redeeming with all of them all at once, not just some types. So that person could come and redeem and get the collateral tokens, and then once that happens, when someone redeems, then actually those reserve stablecoins go out of existence. Now they have these collateral tokens, and so they already have some green coins, and they have 2 of these blue coins, and they can then go redeem these with Compound or whatever it is, and they would get half of this. So I guess we need to kind of have this split in 2 for this to make sense. I'm sure you can see where this is going. Let's say that's one token together. And so redeeming those 2, instead of just getting 2 green coins, you actually get 2.5 green coins. And then these blue assets that are just these tokens that can be redeemed with Compound or another lending protocol, they would be deleted. And so now the person who's redeemed has gotten, instead of just 4 green coins, they've gotten this additional one. So okay, so the point here, the point I'm getting to, is that by holding these tokens that are redeemable within other DeFi protocols, we can get the same economic effect of lending out collateral. And this even goes a little bit further. I think we've already gone through a lot of detail right now, so I'm not going to go through the rest of that right now, but suffice it to say that that pattern can be applied not just with lending protocols, but also with like anything else that DeFi dreams up. And so like the other primary one, if you're someone who's in DeFi, are basically LP tokens. If you deposit your tokens into a liquidity pool on, say, Uniswap or Curve or something like that, then the tokens that you get back are similarly redeemable for, well, they're redeemable for something, later on, depending on how that pool shifts, but also with some revenue from the trading fees that the pool will collect. And so by holding these sort of DeFi bearer asset tokens, we call them sort of bearer assets or bearer instruments, the protocol can basically get a different approach to that yield generation. So let's go like this, kind of like the person with the hat. So this will be our third one. Is basically some form of yield on the collateral. And again, that could be sort of internal to how the protocol works, or external through holding other tokens. So as you can see, if a stablecoin doesn't generate any revenue, let's say it doesn't generate any revenue, let's just say it's backed, 100% by dollar tokens, and it doesn't charge any transaction fees, then maybe it doesn't generate any revenue. In that case, you wouldn't expect any RSR holders to choose to stake because there's no economic incentive to. And because of that, there's no insurance in that particular R token. And so if there were to be a default of that collateral, that default in value would just be passed on to the R token holders, right? So, so if you had a situation where all of a sudden this collateral is worth, not as much, let's say a third as much, well, then these R tokens would also just be worth a third as much. And so because of that, you would expect R tokens and R token governors to look for ways to generate revenue, because they have to pay to have that insurance, to have that backstop. Now, it could be the case that there will be some R tokens that exist that don't really need insurance, because maybe people are comfortable holding some baskets of assets without them needing to be insured, because they just feel good about those particular assets. And that could be, backed by a single token, or backed by, like the current day RSV. Doesn't have any insurance baked into it. It's just a basket of dollar stablecoins, and people are comfortable holding it. So that's something that, that could actually thrive and would not be a source of revenue for RSR holders and RSR stakers. RSR stakers would instead choose to go, bring their stake to baskets that are generating significant revenue. And so something that I really like about that is that it creates a really nice, pure, and open market mechanism for reserve stablecoins to compete for that backing, rather than having a sort of almost more socialist, like socialized approach where RSR stakers could be diluted if there's a default. Like, let's say that there was a default, in this situation in the prior protocol, if there had been a coin like this and there had been a default, well then that smart contract could be like, all right, no problem, we're just going to mint a bunch of RSR in order to pay for that default. And so all of a sudden RSR holders are being diluted, even though that they weren't actually getting any revenue from that stablecoin. There was no benefit to that. Now they're only taking a loss, right? Whereas in this new version of the protocol, it's the case that you only expose yourself to taking a loss if there's a direct benefit that you're getting. And so this sort of evens out the cost and benefit. It makes it so that there can exist reserve stablecoins that don't generate revenue, but they also don't pose any risk to reserve rights token holders. And then the stablecoins that do pose risk to their stakers, they only pose that risk to reserve rights token holders that choose to come and stake. And so if there's something that looks really risky, you can just be like, nah, I don't want to be a part of that. That looks too risky for me. But if something has a good risk-reward trade-off, where it's like, okay, the risk is there, but it's very minimal, and the amount of revenue that is being offered is very significant, then it'll be attractive to go participate in that. And so, so I'm really excited about that updated dynamic, and I think that it's going to set up the incentives for the reserve token ecosystem to actually explore and evolve in a more dynamic and more effective way. And again, the goal is not to have tons and tons of different stablecoins that are all significantly popular. I believe that we will have a Pareto distribution, that there will basically be one winner, and it might be the one that that the reserve core team creates, or it might be one that somebody else creates. It might be one that some other company puts into existence. It might be something that it could even be something that an anonymous person dreams up and parameterizes and puts into existence. And so I'm interested to see how that will play out. I should say that at the very beginning, I don't predict that there are going to be tons and tons of different R tokens, because I don't think that there's going to be that much excitement or incentive to go and create a bunch of them while this is small. I think that part of the reason we're laying the groundwork here is that we think that if one reserve stablecoin gets very big, and a lot of people come and learn how the system works and understand it, then if we have the groundwork in place for people to create additional reserve stablecoins directly within the reserve ecosystem, then it'll be more interesting and attractive to do that than to copy and paste and go create a different alternate version. So we think that this can create a sort of healthy competition within a particular ecosystem and actually with a lower barrier to entry, rather than the ordinary thing that's of course always available, which is that someone can come and fork a protocol and do something similar if they choose to. So I hope that that description made sense. I'm releasing this video because we don't have full documentation yet. We don't have like a fully revised paper. And that's because we've been as focused as possible on figuring it out and building it. Like, we've actually written the code for like this entire protocol, and we're like iterating on that and like working on decentralized governance and trying to launch this as soon as possible. But I just the time was dragging on, and I felt weird about the knowledge of this plan not being available to the community. So I'm deciding to try to put it out there in this form, which hopefully is efficient. It's certainly more efficient in terms of my time than writing out the entire documentation or paper. And then hopefully in the relatively near future, me or others on the protocol team will have time to do that. So I hope this made sense. Please share this video with other people who are trying to understand the updated protocol plan, because I hope that we can come to understand it collectively as soon as possible. And if you have questions, definitely come ask me or others in our public channels, and we'll do our best to answer them.